So, achieving success in comics can sometimes come with a high price to pay, as jealousy, haters, and backlash can turn sweet success into a bittersweet ordeal. The haters usually come in the form of angry comic fans, those that rarely consume anything, legally at least, but who are very angry and loud, at least online. But what happens when those hating and creating the backlash are fellow comic creators? The very people who have faced the same aggressiveness from audiences and critics alike. Well, this happens. This is the sad story of the most controversial Catwoman cover of all time, the Catwoman Zero issue. Spanish artist Guillem March is an unbelievably talented artist. His style displays a perfect balance between strength and sensuality, blending influences from Milo Manara with the heavy inking details of manga, making him an imposing figure within the comic book industry, and one that has sadly become very divisive due to the way he draws certain characters. Like several other creators, Guillem reached superstardom when he became the artist on Catwoman, on the 2011's extremely hated New 52 relaunch, written by Judd Winnick, which, by the way, we will talk about very soon on a different video, so stay tuned. But regardless, this new Catwoman series returned the spiciness back to the character, after a decade of very little sensuality, and quite frankly, lackluster sales. Now, don't take that wrong, because I do love that run. Now, aside from some very vocal detractors, the majority of comic fans welcome Guillem with open arms, as the quality in his work was simply undeniable. His work was not only alluring and sensual, but exciting and dynamic, with a quality level rarely seen in sequential pages, which actually made Guillem become a fan favorite very quickly, overshadowing other Catwoman artists who never gained this much fame or success. Needless to say, despite the controversies, Guillem's Catwoman was selling quite well. However, the negative reaction from readers towards the spicy tone of the book actually made DC remove Judd Winnick and Guillem March from Catwoman, going instead on a different direction with a different team. It should be noted though that even though Guillem was taken off Catwoman, he continued doing the covers up until 2012, when Guillem's cover for the Catwoman Zero issue was revealed. This cover went viral immediately, gaining a huge amount of backlash due to Catwoman's pose, reaching an outrage level unseen before, at least for Catwoman. And yes, I'm counting Jimbalan's Catwoman run as well. After the cover was revealed, multiple articles, YouTube videos, and posts on all social medias were made, attacking, accusing, and calling Guillem all kinds of nasty things. However, as time passed, things got worse, because eventually other fellow comic book artists and creators began mocking him as well, including a former Catwoman artist who at the time had fallen from grace. The long list of comic creators who came together to mock, ridicule, and attack Guillem ranged all the way from the Eisner winner webcomic artist Kate Beaton, who drew several takes on Guillem's cover. Another one was the YouTube animator Josh Rogers, who also took a crack at the Catwoman cover. Then there was the now retired aspiring comic artist Katie Donnelly, who did her own version too. And so did the webcomic creator Meredith Graham. The same goes for the successful independent comic creator John Ellison, who also drew his own version of the cover. And finally, the indie artist Michael Copperman, who also recreated the cover. It should be said that several other non-professional artists joined in as well. Now, I have to admit that some of these are actually pretty funny, and would be completely fine if they were done in a lighthearted, tongue-in-cheek type of way. But that's not the case, as all these illustrations came with some really nasty comments towards Guillem, and seemed more like an excuse to bash him than any real criticism. Shockingly enough, the saddest part of this whole mess was seeing a former Catwoman artist being the harshest critic of them all, not only by recreating the cover, but by offering some harsh words at Guillem. This other Catwoman artist, by the way, is someone who I deeply admire, someone who has an enormous amount of talent, and whom I thought would become a comic book superstar, but somehow didn't. Now please understand that I shall not name this former Catwoman artist to avoid any more drama, as he was eventually accused of some pretty nasty things. This, by the way, is the same artist who called Timbaland's Catwoman a bimbo, when compared to his take on the character. To be fair though, he is far from the only one that has made such low remarks at the lovely Jim. But anyways, Guillem, being the gentleman he is, remained silent throughout this whole ordeal, taking the hate like a champ, until the previously mentioned former Catwoman artist got involved, which proved to be the final straw for him, and what made Guillem finally respond. Now, instead of reacting out of spite and anger like these so-called peaceful critics did, Guillem took the backlash with humor, and drew this little piece for his blog. Now, for those wondering, this is a recreation of his original cover, but with a gingered character posing as Catwoman, possibly the former Catwoman artist mocking Guillem, but in the style of Robert Crumb, who is another highly influential artist who is heavily criticized for his depiction of women in comics. The humorous recreation by Guillem had the message, "Keep on talking," which was obviously aimed directly at the former Catwoman artist. The image also came with a text written by Guillem, where he explained that he was okay with fans criticizing and even mocking his work, whenever they felt he deserved it, because as consumers, they always have the right to complain about what they're paying for. However, he also explained that it was not okay for professionals to be so callous towards each other. Needless to say, Guillem's response made the critics even angrier at him, as it would seem like the response they were looking for was either an apology or an anger-filled rant, which would have been likely used as fuel to continue bashing him anyway. But Guillem did the smart thing and didn't engage, allowing these creators to continue their tirade. The backlash surrounding this Catwoman cover was so loud, so strong and angry, that DC was eventually forced to remove the cover, quickly replacing it with a much less dynamic pose and angle, as well as a more covered-up Selena. Now, here's the biggest irony of that. When the first version of the cover came out, the controversial comic editor and journalist Heidi MacDonald wrote an article heavy criticizing Guillem's work. However, when the cover was replaced by the quote-unquote safer one, Heidi then backpedaled, deleting her previous article on the Catwoman cover and replacing it with another article, only this time in Guillem's defense, or so she claimed, as the article was full of passive-aggressive insults disguised as compliments, calling his art icky, and stating that his work looks like hard plastic. By the way, please excuse me, but if that's what hard plastic looks like, well, whoop-de-doo, I want to look like hard plastic then. For the record, it should also be said that Heidi MacDonald is far better known for all the controversies she has been involved in, rather than her work, as can be seen from the enormous amount of hostility that she has provoked on comic book readers. Anyways, the Catwoman outrage was so out of control that DC not only replaced the cover, but removed Guillem and Judd Winnick from the Catwoman title altogether, which eventually proved to be a terrible decision, as the Catwoman title went through a strange identity crisis following these changes, and slowly became one of the worst comic books from the 2010s. The biggest irony of this whole thing, though, is the fact that Guillem's pose for Catwoman is actually correct, regardless of whether people find it fitting or not. I was going to pose for a recreation, but I'm fat, so I asked my handsome boyfriend to pose for me, and this was the result. As you can see, the pose used by Guillem is very much attainable and correct, so that is settled. In many ways, I consider Guillem March to be the successor of Jim Balent, not necessarily in the art style itself, as they are vastly different, but certainly in their storytelling choices, as their work is full of exciting panels and splash pages, as well as the obvious voluptuous, sensual, strikingly beautiful women. Though sadly, another coincidence between these two artists is also in the critics department, as both of them have been frequently labeled as misogynistic pigs, which they are simply not. Now, I haven't had the pleasure of meeting Guillem, so I can't really vouch for him. But there's a reason he has had such a long-lasting career, working with the same people for as long as he has. As for Jim, I am fortunate enough to have met him multiple times, and let me tell you that both Jim and his wife happen to be some of the nicest, kindest, and most gracious comic creators you could meet. Another thing they have in common, and this might just be the most important one, is the way they deal with the backlash, as both Jim and Guillem have always focused on their work, and have never engaged in any drama. In fact, I have yet to see either of them speak ill of any fellow creators or anyone for that matter, even to those who have attacked them. And that, my dear viewers, speaks volumes. Now, I know this is far from the only case in which comic creators are the ones who bully their peers, but this, to me, seems like one of the silliest and most unfounded cases I have ever seen. To a point where it really does seem like it was done out of spite rather than any real concern for quality. As I said before, Guillem March achieved major success rather quickly, which, with all due respect, none of the other artists or creators mentioned here have been able to do, save for Jim or Milo Manara. And so, whenever an artist manages to succeed so much so quickly, well, it's bound to piss some people off, bringing out their very, very worst. But once again, I have yet to see any questionable behavior from Guillem, which, by the way, is not the case for the people who so harshly criticized him. And almost as if it were a cautionary tale or perhaps a slice of karma, all the people who attacked and bullied Guillem March are still either largely unknown, gave up, or simply never took off. Some became largely hated figures within the comic book scene, and with good reason, and some were even accused of actual crimes and misconducts, which might be the biggest irony of this whole ordeal. But once again, I'm not here to badmouth anyone. Now, years later, the nameless former Catwoman artist was tasked with relaunching Batgirl, which he managed to do with great success. However, when he was questioned about certain logistics regarding his depiction of Batgirl, he simply responded with, "Comics are best enjoyed with imagination. I guess creative liberties are only acceptable when they are used by some." In a classic case of do as I say, not as I do. Now, Guillem, on the other hand, continues to create stunningly beautiful artwork, growing in popularity day by day, even becoming a highly respected writer as well. So let's just hope that in the future people are not so quick to hate on someone, simply for having a different view. But regardless, what about you, dear viewer? Which of these Catwoman covers do you prefer? And most importantly, do you think the backlash and ridicule Guillem had to face was justified? As always, thank you very much for watching. Hope to see you in the next one. Be safe and well. And remember that envy and jealousy come from someone's ignorance and lack of belief in their own skills. Also, look here, thank you so much, YouTube and Google. Thank you so much. I love you. Thank you. I'm back. Yay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.